The question is, do you agree that Scotland should be an independent country?
For me, the principle that we work best when we work together, without coercion or conscription, bullying or bossiness.
Always whenever someone says, oh, peace and sausage, and it's a roll and sausage, and it's sausage roll, we're better together.
Well, they didn't. It was us. We invented it, just like every other bloody thing.
Well, that's very interesting.
We have a very serious the referendum. It seems to me that they're not dealing with the issues.
Hi, if you've been fed up with most of the debate until now, the Scottish Independence Podcast is your chance to hear some different views on what the independence referendum means for Scotland. Hello, this is the Scottish Independence Podcast episode 2. For this one, which was recorded about a month ago, I was in Oxford to meet Andrew Tickell, or Lallands Peat Worrier. Andrew is a PhD student in Oxford, he's an occasional contributor to Newsnight, and he writes for various blogs. His own blog is lallandspeatworrier.blogspot.co.uk. It was a nice summer day in Oxford. The noises you can hear in the background are all the tourists running around in Oxford. And I'd actually had quite a heavy night out for a staff do the night before, but Andrew was very nice and he went easy on me. And we actually did this over a bottle of something quite nice. So we'll just go straight to the conversation again, and we'll have a wee word at the end. I hope you enjoy. Alright, I'm here with Lallands Peat Worrier, who's just off the back of Newsnight and was a witness to a major meltdown. So the first thing is, I'll start you with the same question I started with Donald Adamson, which is, after 305 years, do you think the Union's reaching the end of its trial period?
Oh dear, which just suggests it's going to go into a period in which it would be either come full good, would become, I don't know. I think it's really tricky to say in terms of, I suppose underneath your question is another one, which is it over? Are we going to win the independence referendum? Are we going to lose? I know several people who feel very confident. I'm not really one of them at this stage. I'm a bit sceptical at the present moment about whether that trial stage won't become a full-blown continuing union for a further period of time, I'm afraid.
What do you think it might move to Devo Max option instead?
Here it's really tricky, that, and it comes back to another question, which is how many questions are we going to have in this referendum, which, as far as I can see, still isn't clear for a whole set of reasons. It's not clear what the SNP want, or at least what the SNP leadership want, whether they want 2 questions, which will obviously have a big impact on what happens afterwards. I mean, I think one of the reasons why people want to have a Devo Max question is because they are worried about the nature of the British state if they don't have one. You know, imagine you're a nationalist, or imagine you are a pro-devolutionist that doesn't want to see nationalism crash and burn into disaster, that doesn't want to see an embarrassing defeat for the nation, kind of damaging. Then actually, how do you achieve more devolution in the United Kingdom? If you are a sceptic, you might think, well, if independence loses 30-something%, 40-something%, then without a second question which strongly endorses more devolution, it'll be a triumphant reaffirmation of the British state, and, you know, it just won't happen. Like electoral reform, AV defeated, PR ain't coming. That's the kind of worry, I think, for people who are in favour of...
Do you think if there is a no vote, there's likely to be consequences?
There's always consequences, I suppose. Though it's interesting, it's difficult to see what they would be immediately, clearly. I mean, obviously, there'd be consequences for the SNP, as a political party, which would be actually very interesting to see unfold, because the SNP is a problematic political group at the best of times, but will become all the more so if their central goal doesn't materialise. But I mean, for the Labour Party, to talk in just party political terms, there's obviously will be a pressure to come up with something for the next general election if they're going to kind of walk the walk of doing more devolution and being a bit more serious-minded about their goals. And for the nation, well, I mean, it's going to be an interesting moment. I mean, because we're going to be talking about the nation, trying to imagine it in different shapes. So whether or not, you know, it results in a new sovereign state being created or not, it will definitely be an interesting phase of trying to imagine Scotland in different ways, which inevitably will have its influence across different parts of life.
And how do you imagine it? If there is a yes vote, although you're thinking it's maybe unlikely at the moment, how would you imagine an independent Scotland to be? What would you like to see from it that we don't see as being part of the Union, or that we can't have as being part of the Union?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very large question, isn't it? I mean, I think, one of the things, I'm an adherent to the idea that Britain is a defunct kind of state. It doesn't operate in a meaningful way. It doesn't serve the kind of public goods and public goals I'd want to see in terms of social justice. The fact that we can't even reform the House of Lords shows you that we're in a kind of mad, backward constitutional basket case of a state, which I think we can fix in independent Scotland. Is quite easy to begin to imagine in terms of the sort of fundamental values which would be served by its politics. A democratic value as opposed to a hereditary one would be a good start. But there's a lot up in the air. I really think that we don't at this stage have a kind of full-on Scottish politics yet. We don't take tricky choices about taxation, which undoubtedly will materialise when you make your own choices about these areas. That this idea of, for example, Scotland as a left-wing country in tendency has something to it. It's not utterly vapid, but it's that's the kind of thing which is going to be tested. There's likely to be an emergence of a right-wing, I think, party, or at least right-wing values. For the SNP, it will be quite telling. I'm in favour of the Scottish National Party breaking up into a kind of more satisfactory, more ideological grouping, so we can actually have a kind of proper politics. And that's again one of the features of this kind of hegemonic, rather cosy political structure we have at the moment. That everyone's got such kind of everyone's so well intentioned that we don't really have a sort of proper kind of politics which really has a go with each other and really talks about these different ideological choices in a kind of clear-sighted and honest way. Instead, we have mixed or maxter political parties. So I think there might be pressure to kind of clarify some of that, but equally, the muddy forces will go all the other direction. For the SNP, the urge to stay together will be acute, I'm sure. But
yeah, there's always been a very mixed picture. Recently we've seen Labour for Indy starting up a campaign. But it's always been a very mixed picture with the parties. Like you're saying, the SNP could probably break up after a referendum. Mm-hmm. If it was achieved, then the SNP might become... It's too much of a broad church to stay together. There'd be everybody pulling in too many different directions. The same could happen to Labour and Tory after. Because once you've let the genie out of the bottle, there's no going back. If the independence is achieved, it's absolutely certain that there'd be new parties involved. The whole system would change.
Eventually, I think in the short term it would be quite... The pressures for example, the kind of existing groupings, Labour, SNP, to stick together would be very, very strong. Not at the very least to see that the SNP does deliver independence, then they'd want to be not just the handmaidens of that, but see their child grow up a bit, and there'd be a good and understandable pressure for kind of social stability and not everything being suddenly thrown up in the air, which makes me sort of think that it's quite likely that SNP will continue, but then, as you said, how did they deal with this kind of ideological range of views, from sort of social conservatism to social liberalism to views on tax? You meet socialists in the party, to at the other end people who are very keen on on friendly laugher curves and such like. So I think that there's a question there about, do you keep the broad church? Option one. Option two, I suppose, is if the SNP to become a more ideologically coherent party, and therefore for those elements which don't fit with whatever the ideological coherent bit should leave and from another party. But it's not clear to me, obviously, whether you would get the kind of economically more left-wing, socially more liberal part taking over and becoming the Scottish National Party, or whether the Scottish National Party would become the other side of things, the rural and so on. Yeah,
it's an open question, and also I think a lot of people who vote SNP after an independence vote might not continue to vote for SNP as well after that single issue.
Against that, I suppose the point is that most, as we never tire of hearing, most SNP voters do not vote for the party because of their perspective on independence, which would be another reason to perhaps stick together for a kind of lumpy community of the realm centre. I shouldn't be so cheeky about them, but there's another reason to perhaps do that, to have displaced Labour in that position. Of course, and let's be frank about it, when you've got your hands on power, very tempting to keep your hands on power, as opposed to a self-denying ordinance that just obliterates your own.
Yeah, which is the same reason we've never had electoral reform in the United Kingdom. Because once you've got your hands on power, then...
Yeah, but in that case it's much, much more female, I think, But, it's an interesting question, though, about trying to... And it's something which actually conspicuously the SNP has never spoken about. About what do they envisage their own role after independence. I mean, I think one of my friends, historical friends, was talking about Ireland and about how various of the Irish parties were consciously envisaging their own end after Ireland had achieved its independence. Whereas now that's not really an object of discussion. It's probably a sensible thing not to discuss it, but equally it doesn't give you much confidence, I suppose, that the SNP has a clear vision of the after independence situation.
So yeah, to change the subject a bit, you were on Newsnight to witness the meltdown of Ian Davidson the other day, and he was saying that there were legal blocks before a referendum can come about. What's your take on that? Is he right?
It's a complicated question. I mean, the starting point is, does the Scottish Parliament have the power now to hold a referendum on independence? And if you look at the law, my answer is maybe, arguably yes, arguably no, but it's going to end up in court. That might be a tactically desirable thing for some people. I mean, for certain Scottish nationalists, they might get quite excited about the idea of the UK Supreme Court deciding on these matters. But basically, it comes down to this: under the Scotland Act, the Scottish Parliament has all the powers that it has, apart from those reserved to Westminster. If an act of the Scottish Parliament relates to a reserved matter, then it isn't law, it's outside legislative competence. And one of the reserved matters is the Union in the Scotland Act. Contrary to what Ian Davidson said, the Constitution isn't reserved. Actually, aspects of the Constitution are reserved to Westminster. So as it stands, it's arguable either way in my view, and there are a number of much more evident people than I do who would agree with that. People like Neil Walker at the University of Edinburgh argued this, Eileen McCarg, various others argued that actually you can make quite a strong case that a referendum on a reserved matter isn't necessarily contrary to the Scottish Parliament's powers. I might sound a bit opaque, but the essential test is, what's the purpose of a piece of legislation? Mm-hmm. That's the kind of legal test.
But if they blocked it on, right, you're saying there's kind of arguments either way legally with it, but if they were to block it, what would kind of be the political grounds?
Precisely, and this is the big problem. I mean, this is what's under discussion, this Section 30 idea, because Section 30 of the Scotland Act lets UK ministers change the list of powers that are reserved to Westminster, essentially. So they could do it, all you have to do, they don't have to pass a new Act of Parliament, they just have to put a statutory instrument in front of the House of Commons and the Scottish Parliament and the House of Lords. And that's it done. And if you listen to Jim Wallace and things, he was saying they don't want it to end up in court, so they want to have this referendum. But this is where they get tricky. They don't just want to have the referendum, they want there only to be one question. I think they may be more flexible on the time, potentially more flexible on the franchise, potentially more flexible on what the question is, if it's a one question.
They also still haven't given up on the wording. It's
no.
a recent thing I read.
They haven't, no. So their position is quite unclear. But so the kind of point is that if they wanted to fix it legally, it's so easy it isn't true. Mm-hmm. But they want to do more than just fix it so that it's immune from legal challenge. They want to dictate a few terms. They want, particularly in my view, they particularly want to stop them asking a second question on more devolution. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the sticking point. And that needn't be a problem if the SNP leadership was quite happy to have one question. Mm-hmm. But the fact this is still controversial suggests to me potentially that they're quite keen having a second question. Mm-hmm. And that's why this is likely to lead to political smash. But yeah, from the Westminster's point of view, it's going to end up a mess, because if they don't pass the Section 30 order, Holyrood is likely to legislate anyway, mm-hmm. or try. Someone's going to take it to court, or Jim Wallace, as Advocate General for Scotland, can actually refer it directly to the UK Supreme Court. Could it go
to Europe as well?
No, probably not. I mean, there's not a kind of human rights aspect to it, and there's not a kind of European Union law aspect to it. But the thing is, if we all agree we should have a referendum, mm-hmm. then I suppose what we're disagreeing about is potentially the specifics of the question. But they're all wee things, really. Mm-hmm. It's this second question thing, I think, that's the real bugger. And they'll have to sort it out soon. That's another important thing, that actually they want to pass this. They want to have a kind of 2014 date for the referendum, but the legislative timetable means we've got to get this fixed probably by the end of this year between Westminster and Holyrood. So time's a wasting, and it's not clear to me what's going on really at all.
So, a second part of the legal question. Given a yes vote, what kind of legal manoeuvrings have to go on to extricate Scotland from the United Kingdom system? I know that's an enormous question, but what would be like a few things that they would have to do?
Yeah, I mean, we'd have to reach agreements on various kind of topics. For example, the sea, I mean, the seabed, although there is kind of international law on how you divide up the sea, invariably it's
Blair moved the border a while ago.
Well, he did in domestic law, but that's not necessarily significant for international law. So in international law terms, there's a convention on the law of the sea, which Britain is signed up to, but the kind of exact boundary is kind of debatable, so that will have to be agreed between the kind of rest of the UK as is and the emergent, or soon to be emergent, independent Scotland. There's also be the whole host of the kind of international, the kind of European situation about what precisely is the legal status of Scotland as a successor state to the former UK.
Sounds good just to hear that.
I know it does. So that will be a big question, and it's not EU law, it's not my thing, but reading various lawyers who do know more about it, it's again one of these contentious, tricky things which is likely to be resolved politically. And certainly there's lots of reasons for the EU to want Scotland to be part of it, and we are part of the EU anyway, so we are already EU citizens with the rights of EU citizens to free movement of persons working abroad and that kind of thing.
Although terribly underrepresented in the Parliament.
Yes, though equally the Parliament doesn't do a great deal, as I understand it, institutionally.
No. But I mean, it's that thing where I think it's Denmark or something like 16 seats with the same population as Scotland, and we've got 6.
Yes, no, absolutely. Those are absolutely a dimension of it. But so that's one thing. I mean, and there's lots of other. We've got a kind of great wealth of laws. One of these things that are this phase in the history, we've accumulated vast piles of them. Another thing is the Constitution for Scotland, and I know there's really interesting stuff kind of kicking about on the internet at the moment about people trying to think about this beforehand, about talking about, well, should we be thinking about this before the independence referendum, or should we, well, no, we'll keep it for afterwards. How should we go about formulating a constitution? Should we do so at all? I mean, should we have one? I mean, many people would say, well, yes, of course we should have a written constitution.
Bill of Rights, etc.
That kind of thing, precisely. And there are some interesting models out there. I mean, one that often gets cited was one which was updated by Neil McCormick, who was SNP MEP and a really bright man who died far too young. And it's an interesting starting point. I wouldn't go with actually the McCormick Constitution myself, but to start thinking about these things is really important, to start having a constitutional imagination.
Yeah, I think before is important as well. Would you like the idea of doing it with some kind of public consultation, or do you think it should be a document that's, some clever lawyers draw up and then...
Well, what we want is a bunch of middle-aged men in wigs to hand it down.
Yeah.
Goose quill. Well, no. I don't think so, no. I mean, someone was asking me about this the other day, and they asked whether I mistrusted, whether I thought I should write it, or whether I trusted the public to do it. Which immensely, and I said I would trust the public much more, because actually, it's tricky though. I mean, one shouldn't be too cavalier about how easy it is to engage in these kind of public processes. I mean, one example, the McCormick Constitution, which was produced by the SNP way back, was basically realised in the Scotland Act in many respects. So it suggested that the Scottish Parliament, you could take a case to court and challenge an Act of Parliament on the basis of fundamental rights. And the fundamental rights that were written down in that Constitution were based on the European rights, the European Convention on Human Rights. And that's what we got in the Scotland Act. But interestingly, you've been having a few politicians in Scotland who've been having a go at courts reviewing Scottish parliamentary legislation on the basis of fundamental rights recently, and as if that had no impact in the future, And I understand in the short term it can be fun to have a go at judges for making decisions about these issues, but actually it's really trivial to do that, because it means we're not starting to think constitutionally. We're not thinking about what choices about who makes decisions, what power should court have, should we have fundamental rights which are judicially protected, and what kind should we have.
Who's doing the best writing on these issues at the moment? On
the Constitution? Oh dear. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, there's various people that kind of are sticking their oar in, which is as it should be, precisely. I mean, there's a blogger called Edinburgh Eye. I don't know who she is, actually, but she's been writing a whole series of posts, which is kind of responses to the sections of the McCormick kind of Constitution. And it's important questions. It goes to things like, like the European Convention on Human Rights deals with mostly political, civil rights, rights to fair trial, that kind of stuff. But, the more politically problematic ones, the edgier ones, you know, social rights, economic rights, cultural rights, and do we want to make these enforceable or not? I mean, that's a really politically profoundly charged question, or would be if we thought about it enough.
Okay. And then on to the more kind of media side of it. Obviously, you've got quite a successful blog yourself. You've been on BBC a couple of times and stuff. What do you think about the difference between the sort of blogosphere and the mainstream on this? Because if you look at something like, okay, although Ian Davidson's accusing the BBC of being pro-SNP, which is one of the most ludicrous things I've ever heard in my life, they're clearly not. They're clearly protection of the British state is what the BBC is for in many respects. Like another podcast I did with David Miller, and we talked about Lord Reith writing in his diary, you can trust the BBC not to be impartial on serious issues, that's the founder of the BBC. And in many ways nothing's changed in that respect. So you've got the kind of mainstream media fiercely defending the state, and a lot of the United Kingdom state, and a lot of the bloggers trying to break it up, quite frankly. I mean, what do you think about the total disconnect between the two, or do you think there is?
Well, I think there's a few. I mean, if you wanted to do an anthropology of the Scottish blogosphere, it's quite significant about who's missing. I always think that's an interesting question. And you know, while there have been some attempts for kind of particularly unionistic, but that's like not the main fault line in Scottish politics necessarily. But you know, an absence of Labour bloggers, an absence of Tory bloggers. I mean, I think the question of bias is interesting because it raises this kind of idea of consciousness. Are you consciously sitting evilly in your back chamber, writing away malicious schemes?
Yeah. So you're feeling really guilty about George Fulks' accusation you're siding that?
Well, you know, yeah, because obviously I have a secret. Me and my secret legions march forth and do the bit. But it's. I think it's interesting. I suspect people do not consciously think. People don't. Again, I mean, it goes back, I suppose, to a particular kind of sociology, which I'm quite keen on. Which, you know, thinking about the kind of implicit, the modes of thought which people start kind of taking on, which they don't necessarily do so consciously. That actually, if you ask of someone who operates at the BBC or whatever, or who writes in the Scotsman, say, are they biased? They will tell you probably quite plausibly, no, I'm not. I give them a fair wind. But it's this kind of. I think we need to think about how our debate is shaped in a kind of more implicit way about how kind of modes of thought, tracks of discourse take us down either pro or a kind of anti-nationalist perspectives, and it's actually much more subtle and much more difficult to talk about than simply you're biased, you're lying, you're stitching me up.
Because it has become very, very adversarial, and it's just going to get worse in the run-up to the... You know, you've got the wacky world of George Fulks every so often coming out, accusing everyone of being, I don't know.
But he's a comedy turn. I mean, that's his job.
But then, so that makes us vicious cybernats for saying that. You see, we're just deliberately
cybernats.
Yeah, we're just deliberately destructive, and we lie because we don't agree with his mad pronouncements. But. I
mean, I think it's interesting about whose disagreement is pathologised, because that is what it is. I mean, I wrote something a wee while back about Labour's cybernat problem, in which I was sort of arguing that it's not about the question of whether there are people online that hurl abuse and treat each other with hideous contempt, because of course there is. Go anywhere over the world and you will find somebody, slagging someone else rotten and making insane suggestions about each other. The thing about which strikes me as really interesting is this the character of the cybernat, the construction of the cybernat as a phenomenon, such that we use it casually as if we all knew what it meant. Mm-hmm. It strikes me that serves this kind of ideological function for people in the Labour Party particularly, but also for Tories and things, which regards nationalists as sort of inherently rather pathological, bizarre, inwardly. They may smile to your face, but pull away the mask and they're snarling away. And it's madness. It really is madness. And my friends in the Labour Party don't believe it at all. But it is a part of our public debate, a sort of expectation that people are secret racists. I mean, the number of times that you sort of people say, "Well, yes, of course, yes, I'm a racist because I'm a nationalist." I think that doesn't make any sense at all. It's a kind of outrageous allegation. Mm-hmm. And yet, people in the Labour Party, people in the Conservative Party who, adopt particular policies which I would consider to be racially, and ethnically problematic. Yeah, they slag you off for being being a villain. But
you recently wrote a blog about the polling that's going on around independence, but not the yes, no, maybe part, but the demographics of it. So what were you saying in that article?
Well, I've been looking at it for quite a long period of time. I was looking at demographics initially about just ordinary Scottish politics, because the SNP has historically had a big gender gap. But if you look at independence polling, it's carried through into that as well. That support for independence among women is usually around 15% behind men, which is vast. It's a vast gap. These polls are about 1,000 people, so they are accurate up to a point, but often the demographics are much smaller. But at least for the men and women, they're about half and half, so you can be pretty sure quite consistently that there is something going on there.
Well, it's an enormous gap if it's 15%. It's well known that women generally tend to vote more right-wing than men, but it's only a very small percentage. It's a gap of 3% more. It's not something huge like 15%. So why do you think that might be?
I think that's really difficult to tell, and one reason it's difficult to tell is that there are lots of different demographic splits as well. So we don't know, for example, take social class, and the pollsters use different measures. Some use percentiles of deprivation, some people use social categorisations based on the occupation of the head of household and the kind of ABC1 model. But we don't know how it breaks down in terms of sort of bourgeois women, working class women, whatever you want to call them, rural women, urban women. So I think it's really difficult to tell at the moment, which is a frustration. It would make a fascinating thing to do research on, actually, but as we go into the referendum. And I know various of my female friends, if I asked them, they would say caution among women as potentially an explanation, an interest in other kinds of political... The fact that perhaps the yes camp for independence has not really connected up independence as a kind of constitutional strategy to a political case for a change in the way we do politics, a change in what we deliver, which might appeal to women. I mean, I don't know if those are convincing arguments. They will be perhaps for some people and won't be for others. But it's a big thing. I mean, so there's gender, there's also social class, that the most deprived fifth of Scots are, I think it's more than women are more in favour of independence than the richest section of Scots. That actually the richest section of Scots are much more likely to be opposed to independence, which perhaps shouldn't be very surprising, but it is very, very stark. It's a very stark kind of line, and we're just not talking about it at the moment. We just don't talk. We talk about top lines. We don't talk about gender. We don't talk about class. We don't talk about geography. But equally, these are things we don't talk about in Scotland in general.
Sometimes it's mentioned the generational aspect to it, whereas the kind of wartime generation that are more pro-union, whereas the younger generation tends to be more for independence. But that one gets talked about a bit more.
It does, though the evidence of it is worse arguably than the other ones, because the percentiles are the samples for each age categorisation are so small that they boom all over the place. They go up and down because you're talking about a couple of hundred 18 to 24-year-olds. But equally, it sort of makes sense. I mean, think about generations which have been brought up in a kind of political life in the UK where the Scottish Parliament has always existed, and that is the young people of today, and that will affect how you think about politics. And I think we haven't really thought about the kind of generational impact that even having a Scottish Parliament will have in terms of how young people, how new generations even imagine their politics and where they imagine it happening.
Okay. Speaking of things that will affect your politics, have you been feeling very patriotic and British during the Olympics? Have you been singing the national anthem, for heaven's sake?
Yes, well, obviously I have a very sweet singing voice. No, I'm of on the kind of Marino scale of identities, I would describe myself as Scottish, not British. I've never really got much juice out of Britishness, I'm afraid. But it's been really interesting to see with the Olympics about how we've been talking about Britishness and celebrating it selectively through our British Broadcasting Corporation and various other things.
Channel 4 describing it as England a couple of times, they've been caught out. I'm not sure if it's happened on BBC, but yeah, Channel 4 definitely. Well done, Team England.
Really, I mean, some of my friends in down here have occasionally done that and made the wee slip, and then they've hastily corrected themselves. They got kind of scorching glance from me, but it's quite. I mean, it just shows you again, and that's a very complicated topic, but about just how Britishness is this problematic identity for Scots, yes, but also for the English, about how it's the kind of primary English identity, British. It's quite a kind of curious phenomenon, and you could see why it's kind of a bit of a carnivalesque, because Englishness is such a kind of problematic thing. I think, to think about and talk about in England, whereas Britishness is unproblematic in lots of ways. You can celebrate it, it doesn't ask much of you, and it's kind of a united thing, and actually it's potentially a politically quite progressive. And this is something which I know some of us might spasm at, but actually a desire for a certain sense of solidarity and shared interests and a communal life. I don't think Britishness can necessarily deliver it, but I think it's an aspiration which one shouldn't be snide about.
You think you've been living down here for a while, and you know, in the media, or in the English media, there's a two-track thing. If I read like the Daily Mail, you'll read like Quentin Letts, and, you know, like let's get rid of these bloody Scots, and that kind of tone of it. But then, if you go over to something like The Guardian, it's like they seem hurt that, like, the idea the Scots could be thinking about independence. Yeah. They seem like personally hurt or offended. Oh, we were their friends.
What have we done?
Yeah, what have we done? And then there's a kind of resentment breeding because they feel hurt about something. Yeah. How do you find it interacting with people down here about it?
That's really interesting, and I think the two models you just described, I've definitely met examples of both, and I'm really glad I'm down here actually in some respects, because it's really fascinating. I think the main thing which I find interesting is we have a proliferation of kind of internet sources now. It's not hard to find out about Scottish politics. It's not like the old days when you couldn't get a copy of the Glasgow Herald down in England. Anyone can find out about Scottish politics now. They can go online, at least the kind of AIR campaign, the public, for instance. People don't. That untold,
they can, but they don't.
They can, but they don't.
Well, it's the same. I've been all around the world, but I've never been to Scotland. Yeah, it's the same.
Yeah, and it's like so and it's really fascinating that we have this divergence in terms of a sort of discourse that the UK press are often seem totally clueless, or they feel clumsy in terms of their commentary about Scotland, or they have these kind of odd hackneyed images of romanticism, and it's just unrecognisable if you actually follow Scottish politics. So I think it's really interesting that the liberty of the internet has coincided with this sort of parting of ways, where the potential links that could connect up a journalist, say in London, to Scotland just aren't being followed through, which I think suggests a kind of underlying social thing, that there's this kind of drift going on in terms of public spheres, where particularly I think the kind of London press just don't really feel as if Scottish politics is about them, which is fine. I don't think it's something to feel snarky about, but it is sociologically and sort of politically quite important as we come up to a referendum where we are still part of this political body. I think that's kind of interesting, but I think you're right about this kind of the combination of the kind of sod off and hurt thing, and I think both of the kind of sod off and the hurt responses kind of betoken a certain lack of understanding about what the point is, why you're doing it, what sort of ambitions you have, why might you want to do it, what's wrong with us, I think that's the kind of so try and put it in constructive terms and to imagine Scottish nationalism as something which isn't just a kind of romantic nonsense or an atavistic ethnic project.
That's the thing I noticed. The debate in England is much more emotional and romantic than the one in Scotland. It's not in Scotland. It's not freedom. It's being quite, not all the time, but very often it's being very pragmatically discussed. It's being discussed in political and legal, economic terms. Here, it's in England. It's described in a much more emotive way. I found, both negative and kind of positive.
I think Ed Miliband's speech, I don't know if you saw it, but he was talking about bad Englishness and bad
I tend to fall asleep when he starts.
But it was really interesting because his argument, as I read it anyway, was essentially a British nationalistic one. If you feel British, stay with the UK. It wasn't, because quite often from the Labour Party, and I actually believe many of these people believe this, you have what I think Colin Kidd called like an instrumental unionism. Stay in the Union for the solidarity of the British working class to deliver social justice across the UK. Now that sounds potentially a project which is not unattractive actually, but that wasn't the one Ed Miliband was promoting at all.
No.
It was a feel British, stay in the UK, and therefore it's much more nationalistic, ironically perhaps, than sort of arguments you might hear from Alex Salmond for why he wants Scottish independence. And yet people don't seem to notice that, which I think is this kind of significant thing, that the old models of explanation aren't really serving us terribly well in terms of...
Well, it's also, I think, in part because with old models of explanation, one of the weaknesses of the state, the better together, them, is that they can't admit why they really want to keep the union together. They can't be honest about it. which is one I think will become one of their fatal flaws. I mean,
what is the honest explanation?
There's two fundamental reasons. The economic one, the resources, the natural resources one, and there's also one that Jack Straw did admit, but they never ever talk about it, which is they're terrified of losing their seat on the UN Security Council if the United Kingdom is broken up. And then with losing a seat on the United Nations Security Council, the loss of influence that would entail. I mean, these aren't the only reasons, but they are obviously two of the biggest ones. And that Security Council one, that prospect terrifies them politically. It's just one of the reasons the political class of the United Kingdom are dead set against independence of Scotland. And this is one I think is never discussed.
No, I mean, that isn't. I mean, it comes back to sort of British self-imagining about what is its purpose of Britain, what is the character, these kind of imperial ghosts which get risen up now and then, and I know many of us feel very uncomfortable about that, those kind of aspects of sort of imperial and warlike Britannia and full flag. That's kind of scary. I think it's interesting. I mean, one thing this whole, you mentioned earlier, the Labour for Independence thing, and I must admit I'm not entirely sure if I really believe that's a goer, whether it's one or two folk making mischief, and I'm happy for them to make mischief, but I think it might amount to that. But I think there is another question we can ask, I mean, about the better together thing. If we're better together, well, how are we better? What is better? Well, what's the nature of this?
We're on the UN Security Council.
That could be an answer. I mean, I wouldn't say that was enough of a good reason to stay together. But I think for the Labour Party, even if this Labour for Independence thing which has come out isn't particularly credible, it might be. I don't know if it is, but whether it's a small grouping or whatever, it doesn't really make sense to me that it needs to be a small grouping. Or why should it be? I mean, if the Labour Party aren't nationalists, if they scorn nationalism, if they are merely instrumental socialists who forgot to be instrumentally socialistic, then why are they all in favour of the union? It's something which I think, without a partisan hat on, I find it quite confusing. It makes no sense to me. It doesn't seem to me obviously absolutely knocked down clear that the only way to instrumentally achieve socialism or something of that ilk is through the union. But that's what we're invited to believe by Joanne Lamont and friends when they say that everybody in the Labour Party scorns the whole nationalistic project. I don't think they can. It doesn't make any sense to me if they do.
Right, just to finish up, we've still got a little time before the referendum. I don't think I'd be taking too much of a liberty if I said I think you're hoping for a yes vote, even if you're not convinced we're going to get one. But so what would you like to see happen in the run-up? Like, what would you like to see the Yes campaign doing in the run-up to bring about success?
Yeah, I would definitely want to see a yes result. I think it's really tricky, though. I mean, in terms of to know what to do, how do you deliver? Because we have at present polling which shows about 30-odd% of the Scottish population is in favour of independence. If you factor in, turnout and such like that, then you're looking at convincing still a damn large amount of people about a project which people reasonably have several questions. And one thing which I was wondering about before, and I've not really made up my mind about, is this idea that the SNP has to give the Scottish people a clearer perspective, if you like, think we're going to do this, here's what it's for. And I was arguing that, we have to be the kind of cartographers of New Scotland, map out what we're going to do.
Constitution, you said earlier.
Constitution, but also wider questions about what kind of politics we want, why are we doing it, why are our present powers not enough to let us do it within the Union. But arguably Alex Salmond has done this. He's just not done it in a way that I particularly find exciting, keeping the monarchy, the NATO change which is proposed, which isn't decided yet for the SNP, but we'll see what happens with that. It's going to be tricky with that kind of model, a kind of safety first, reassuring model of kind of pro-independence advocacy. How do you get past the kind of very simple question, well, what's the point? Why are we doing this? Why go through this dramatic constitutional change if we have such limited goals? Now, one option you could pursue is a very radical kind of programme of clearly setting out what you want to do and why you can't, but I understand equally that Salmond and things don't want to put people off, they want to be careful, they want to be floaty in the middle, and so my feeling is that we have to stop thinking about Scotland as one public, but think of it as kind of multiple publics, and realise that different people will be convinced by independence for different reasons, some of which will actually be incompatible with one another, and that really...
That's the norm for any nation.
Yeah, exactly. And we have to. I think we also have to. It sounds so trivial, but I was reminded recently of this Alistair Gray's quote about Lanark, about Glasgow, about imagining no one ever lives in Glasgow, even imaginatively. And I think the same is true about lots of areas of Scottish life, that despite the emergent spaces of our democracy, we still do have a very small public sphere which doesn't talk about things as much as it should. We don't, like class in Scotland, gender in Scotland, all of these different strands, we don't really have we've not talked about these things enough, and actually the referendum will be a chance to imagine these things in different ways, and that's actually a great labour in and of itself, because it raises these sort of existential questions about who we are as a people, and all of the tensions and wonderful complexity of that. And I do hope that doesn't get lost. I hope that we don't become too monolithic, too frozen, and too insensible to our own interesting controversy. I hope you said earlier that we're going to go into a phase of sort of increasing acrimony and polarisation, which seems unfortunately quite likely and will present its own challenges for kind of post-referendum. But I do hope that somewhere in there we keep a sense of nuance and the fact that we're not really enemies. We're not talking about things which are radically irreconcilable. It's not a question of one person having a legitimate view and the other person being off their chump. That we're all kind of arguing, hopefully reasonably respectfully as people. So I hope we keep something of that as we go into it.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Do you want a pint?
Yes.
Okay. So, thanks to Andrew Tickell, or Lallands Peat Worrier, whichever you prefer. I actually asked him which one he preferred, and he told me they were both the same person. That was a good conversation, and we had a much more libellous one in the pub later on, but that hasn't been recorded, or the evidence was quickly destroyed. No, it wasn't recorded. Okay, so there's a few announcements to make. The Scottish Independence podcast is now on iTunes. If you just go to the iTunes in the search in the store and type in Scottish Independence podcast, it'll come up. It's the one with the saltire with the Dissolve the Union. It would be of a good help to us if you could leave a review or a rating on there. It would be much appreciated if you could go on and do that. Also, after this episode, they're not going to be available on SoundCloud anymore. It's all moving over to Spreaker, so you might have to go over there to download it. If you think you'd like to contribute or get involved in any way, please get in touch with me. It's at mgreenwell on Twitter, or email me. You can find my email on my blog at michaelgreenwell.wordpress.com. Also thanks to someone called Hunted Fox, who's letting us use an image he created for the podcast. Thanks to Mike at Bella for helping out. For the first episode, we had more than 600 people listen, which I think is great for the first one. I'd like to try and get this one up to more than 1,000, so if you could tell some of your friends if you've enjoyed it, send some links, Twitter, Reddit, etc. That would be great, and it's all much appreciated. Alright, it's time to finish up now, and if you remember what Andrew said just at the end there about how we should all get along, maybe I think a bit of counselling would be a good idea. So what I've got here is a song by Stanley Odd, a Scottish hip-hop group, who were nice enough to let us use their song Marriage Counselling. So enjoy, and I'll speak to you next time.
Dear Britannia, things aren't right, we have to face it. I don't appreciate the procrastination, I'm just saying. It's not like you're pure amazing and I'm fed up feeling like the poor relation. And I don't appreciate your passive aggression. Is it too much to ask that you answer my questions? So I'm writing this metaphor. I said it before, but I put more into us than you ever give me credit for. We're needing some help. What makes you think I can't speak for myself? And as for the division of wealth, I'm a 1,000-year-old country. Surely I'm old enough now to look after my own money. As for that nonsense about me being destitute, hey, and I got the same damn group of friends as you. So stop implying that if you were to get shot at me, France, Germany and Spain wouldn't talk to me. I feel like I'm banging my head off a brick wall. P.S. Do you think of me at all? Faithfully yours, Caledonia. Dear Caledonia, this grief is something that I wouldn't miss. I'm tired of having to keep you in food and drink. Since Culloden, it's been like a constant battle, with you causing me nothing but hassle. When you've been hella short-tempered lately, I thought we'd agreed to forgive and forget the 1980s. I told you before how I actually felt. I just don't think you can be trusted to look after yourself. I know sometimes I don't give you enough attention, but I've got a lot on my plate with the current recession. As for being mature enough to handle your financial payments, look at Greece, she's older than you and they just called in the bailiffs. You show nothing but poor judgment, why should I trust it? Your tram fiasco, way over budget. Your parliament building, way over budget. And you wonder why I don't want to discuss it? Stop meddling. You're being childish and petulant. You wouldn't fare well in a divorce settlement, accept it. I know better, I don't need this added pressure. P.S. Weren't we always good together? Sincerely yours, Britannia. Britannia, I don't appreciate your tone, wind your neck in. Don't even get me started on the years of oppression. Every time I need money for spending, I shouldn't need to come begging for you to give it your blessing. I'm not a lapdog, a pet of a petulant Wayne. I'm an equal and I expect to get treated that way. I'm setting it straight. This is hardly blissful matrimony. I've got resources, so I shouldn't have to ask for money. I support myself, so don't mention alimony. And I don't need you to fight my battles for me. So tell your mates in Faslane they need a new address. I see the truth with my new clear head. My pal Alex says you're blind to the facts, and it's time for me to stand and draw a line in the sand. Everybody's got an opinion and I'm sick of it. I'm getting pulled in all directions with this constant bickering. It's like a smokescreen I'm struggling to see through. P.S. half of me doesn't really want to leave you. Caledonia, bitch, moan, give me a break. All you ever seem to do is complain. Maybe it's all that booze in your brain, or you're woozy again from the smack running through your veins. You're nothing but a drain on me, and it's plain to see you've developed more unhealthy habits that I seem to need to pay to keep. Basically, you need to stop your foolish ways, stop pulling away and start pulling your weight. Pulling my weight? Who do you think you're talking to? This is exactly what makes me want to walk away. I'm tired of stating all my reservations. I think maybe we should try a trial separation. You're blatantly economic with the facts. Arrogant, self-centred, living in the past. Reliving your former glory most days now. Back when you were the biggest bully in the playground. A shadow of your former self, and it's plain to see you're falling apart and trying to put the blame on me. I used to make things, inventions, you curbed my creativity, held me back and injured me by ending my industry. All I'm saying is the balance isn't right. Either change or I'm leaving, it's decision time. Decisions? You don't have the power to make those, and you're going nowhere unless I say so. You're useless. Who else would want you but me? All the plans that you make end in constant defeat. You think we're really through? All that's left of you is disease and booze, and you can't see the truth, obsessed with green and blue. After all we've been through, I'd be doing you a favour, keeping you. Pipe down and stop being so mouthy. The truth is you'd be nothing without me. An alcoholic, sectarian, illiterate lout. I'm providing the medicine, you're just spitting it out. Without me you wouldn't last 2 minutes. In fact, I don't even care if we're finished.